Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Penn State. They hired Jim Knowles. They have pushed their chips to the center of the table for 2025, and with that comes a lot of pressure. And we'll talk about that obviously in more detail throughout this week, but definitely some things you're going to want to watch very closely around Penn State really throughout the rest of the season. You know, them and Texas are probably going to be the two most talked about teams, and it'll be fascinating to see what happens in 2025 with those two. But let's get to some tampering rumors, and you hate to talk about it, but it's probably something that we got to get into. So, the long story short, essentially, it sounds like Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate were offered a lot of money to find their way out of Columbus, Ohio, and find their way to a new school. The school is unknown. It will always be unknown. No one's going to say this school tampered with me because they understand that it would come right back to the team that they're on. So that's not going to happen. Just plain and simple, we will likely never figure out which teams these are now. There were some rumors around Texas. There were some rumors around Oregon. Those are always going to be the teams that have rumors around them when elite wide receivers find their way into the portal or allegedly finding their way into the portal. So it could be the case. I wouldn't be necessarily overly surprised if that was the case, but I'm also not going to say absolutely that was the case. So Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate, incredible players. Elite athletes. I think they're going to be fantastic at Ohio State next year, maybe even a little bit better than what they had with Emeka Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith this year. But Jeremiah Smith was reportedly offered $4.5 million. Carnell Tate was reportedly offered $1 million from an unknown school to leave Ohio State. We won't know who that team is, but regardless, it seems like they were tampering, plain and simple, and it's something that we talk about one way or the other. And there's a couple of things happening here. There's a couple of different things that kind of play into this and kind of make this a reality. And some of it is real, some of it is not so real, some of it helps people, some of it doesn't help anyone, but a couple of very specific people. So we'll get into that here in a second. But overall, I think when you talk about everything that's happening around college football, these are two elite wide receivers. These are two guys that are making every type of play and absolutely are guys that a lot of people are going to want on their roster. The reality is, these are two guys that were in between a national title and a championship parade, and they were getting calls for millions of dollars. They were having to figure out their future. They were having to talk to their family. They were having to do a million things, but enjoying the accomplishment that they just did. And I don't understand it. It's something that has to change kind of across the sport, that we don't allow these kids to enjoy what they just did and then be able to enjoy things afterwards because of all the craziness around them. Even a couple of Ohio State players and Notre Dame players dropped out of the Senior Bowl this past weekend because the season's too long. They can't play football right after that. That is another issue here, and it's definitely something that we have to figure out. So you're putting these kids in a really bad situation. But overall, what's happening here is a big-time question for a lot of people because a lot of people are confused by these reports, by what's happening, and by just the structure behind the scenes of what tampering is. And it's hard to pin down in a lot of different respects. It's hard to figure out the exact way it's happening, the way people are going about it. All the different intricacies are not an easy thing to figure out. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing, and let's talk about the biggest one, or maybe not the biggest one, but agents lying about the price is a very real thing in this sport. They do this in pretty much every sport, but college football, it's kind of become a relatively new phenomenon with NIL. Is these kids have agents, and some of them have quote-unquote agents. There's a difference between those two, and it's very clear when you hear one of those guys talk. But at the end of the day, it's one of those worlds that we're very new to, and it's one of those worlds that every agent across the country has been just waiting for this to unfold, and then they jumped to and made sure that they locked up a lot of 18-year-olds that don't really know much better about the way that they should be represented, about the money that they should be getting, and mainly about the money that they're giving to their agent. You know, there's a lot of different stories about agents charging 20% agent fees. I'm telling you right now, I don't know much about this business. I know for a fact that if you're getting charged 20% agent fee, you are being robbed. Plain and simple. Any agent that admits to doing that, which is something that someone did here pretty recently, they deserve to not be in this business anymore. Plain and simple. You know, you're in the business of, yes, you know, you got a job to do. You got money to make. I'm not arguing that. You also got to do right by your clients. And it sounds like a lot of people in this business are not. And it leads to something like this, where I'm not necessarily saying this absolutely happened in this case, but it has happened before, where you have a quarterback or you have a big-time running back in the portal, and it comes out one day that so-and-so is offering him $1.2 million. And then you hear that he signed for 1.5 somewhere else. That 1.2 was probably 800,000. You know, that 1.5 down the road was only there because of the 1.2 that was reported. So this is just the reality of sports in a lot of respects. These agents have different lines to some insiders that can release certain information for them to make their client look a little bit more interesting, to make a little bit more grandiose in a lot of respects. And it's something that you kind of battle back and forth on. It's not going to be an easy fix one way or the other, but it is something that has to be figured out. Not necessarily this whole agents lying to reporters, because most teams will be able to take that with a grain of salt going forward. But I do think it's a problem that we have certain people in this sport that just aren't agents. They're not. They call themselves agents, but they are not remotely qualified to be agents. They're not remotely even licensed to be agents in a lot of respects. And now you look up at a system that is entirely broken and run by the wrong people, and then you just add in agents that have nothing to do but make the money that they can. It creates a really, really bad situation for these kids, and definitely puts them in a position where they're making decisions that they don't even know the decision that they're making. And that actually brings me to the next part of this. This is the system being broken, just plain and simple. This is the system being broken. It's the reality where we can get mad at schools for tampering, as if everyone doesn't participate. And we can get mad at the kids, even though they're making decisions that I think a lot of us would make in their similar shoes. But the reality is, we got to blame the people up top. We got to blame the people that are actually setting this thing up, that actually have the power to change a lot of the things in the respect, whether it's change the need for, or change the requirements for agents to get into the business, whether it's change the way that we do the transfer portal, the way we do NIL, whatever it is. There are certain people up top, including Charlie Baker and a lot of people over at the NCAA, that have set this up as a player rights movement. And you've given the player a lot of power. You have not given the system to yield that power effectively, to yield that power smartly, and that's what you should be doing at all times. That should never not be the goal in college football, is to make sure you get the most money out of these guys. That's not the goal. The goal is always to make sure these guys are making the best, most confident, most smart decisions for their future as we move forward. We're putting them in a really bad spot to do that. We're making sure that every single coach can call them whenever they want. And you have a million guys thinking about a million different things when they should be thinking about the national title that they just won. And all of it comes back to the NCAA. It's no disrespect to the NCAA, because some of this is over their head, if I'm being totally honest. Some of this is just above their pay grade at this point. But at the end of the day, I think you look at what is happening around the sport, and coaches not knowing what the rules are and acting accordingly by not knowing what the rules are, as are the players. We have to find a way forward, and it has to be essentially outside of the NCAA. I don't think there's any way you go forward with the NCAA and figure all this stuff out. So that's going to be the next iteration of this thing, and you just got to hope that the right people step up at the right moments. And that's something we'll talk about later in the week, probably get into a little bit of detail of how I would run college football and stuff tomorrow, so definitely be on the lookout for that. But the system is broken, and teams are taking advantage of a broken system, and I can't necessarily fault them for that too much. So that's going to be something definitely to watch. But the other part of this was a comment that Ryan Day made earlier in the week, and it was something that frustrated me just a little bit, and not probably for the reasons that a lot of y'all are thinking, but I think this is the quote right here, is, I think one of the biggest issues across college football right now is enforcement, is what he said. He said on the Dan Patrick Show, and everyone lost their mind. Everyone collectively came out and said, well, you tampered just as much in the past cycle, so how can you be crying about people tampering for your guys? How can you go after certain coaches and certain schools for doing the exact same thing that you did? First, that is not how those recruitments went down. If you listen to the recruitments of any of the guys that they got in this past year, and we'll get into that here in a second, but if you were around those recruitments by any means, you understand that's not how it went down. Second, even if he did, let's just say he did. Let's say he was talking to these guys in the middle of a game. He was texting them on the sideline while they were playing Auburn to get Caleb Downs, which he wasn't. Let's just say he was, just for fun. He's not wrong. It doesn't make him wrong, and it doesn't make any of the coaches that speak out about this wrong. It just means they're saying what everyone else needs to be saying. And Ryan Day, being a head coach that just won the national title, kind of his obligation to say a lot of this thing. We saw it with Kirby Smart a couple of years ago, where he said, this game is really going in a bad path. Right after he won a national title, he didn't take the chance to take a victory lap, to call out his haters, to do any of that stuff. He decided to make sure that the sport was in a better place going forward. It's exactly what Ryan Day is trying to do here. And I understand the frustration. Ohio State did a lot in the portal and did a lot of great things, but the reality of those situations are very different than what I've seen online, and we'll go into this really quickly. Will Howard, he was pushed out of Kansas State, plain and simple. They wanted Avery Johnson to start. They said, you're better off going to find somewhere else to play. He did. He went over to Ohio State. That's a very good pickup. Nothing really crazy there. Happens all the time. Caleb Downs, his coach retired. He was not going to leave Alabama. If Nick Saban was the head coach this year, he would have been in Crimson this year. So that's the reality of that situation. OSU finished second in his high school recruiting, and he was going to find his way to Ohio State. Now, if you were to ask me, I think Ohio State might have stolen him from Georgia more than they stole him from Alabama. If I'm being totally honest, that was the team that I thought he was going to end up at, and then Ohio State swoops in and gets him. And then you have Seth McLaughlin. Ran out of town, plus his coach retired. So he was not going to stick around. The fans did not want him to stick around. And with Parker Brailsford coming in, kind of worked out for both parties in a lot of respects. And then Quinshon Judkins, in a lot of respects, he was run out of town. In a lot of respects, there were a lot of fans saying he's a locker room cancer, saying he can't handle this, saying he's not the guy that you want around your program. And it's going to push people's buttons. That's just the reality of that situation. Quinshon Judkins is a very, very good football player. You keep telling him that he's not a good football player and he's a bad teammate, he's going to find his way out of town, one way or the other. And then he came in to be a combo guy. He didn't come in to be the immediate guy for Ohio State. He came in and they asked TreVeyon Henderson, and TreVeyon Henderson actually had veto power over this addition. He wanted him there. And that's a thing that I think a lot of people are just purposely overlooking, if I'm being totally honest, when we talk about this portal classes. Ohio State did a lot of the things right. Now, there was the incident with Caleb Downs, but the reality was it was just Caleb Downs posted on his story that he was in the portal. The paperwork hadn't processed yet. That's plain and simple it, and frankly, I would break my finger trying to call Caleb Downs immediately when I found out he was in the portal, no matter how I found it out. So this is something that, obviously, we can talk about more, and we'll probably get into a couple of different things, talking about this tampering world and try to figure out some of the different solutions down the road, probably tomorrow when we get into that in a little bit more detail. But overall, the sport's in a bad place. I don't think that needs to be said to anyone right about now. I don't think anyone needs to disagree with that. I don't think anyone would. But at the end of the day, we are in a place where there are so many great things that can happen over the next 2 or 3 years if we just say, when Ryan Day says something like that, if we don't scoff him out of the room because he's benefited from that, if we don't scoff people out of the room because they're, yes, benefiting from a broken system, but also exposing that broken system. We have to find a way to agree with, to not necessarily always agree with the coaches that and what they're saying, but at least give them more leeway to talk. At least give them the platform to talk and figure out kind of a pathway forward. Obviously, a lot of people are in favor of commissioners coming into the mix, maybe one, maybe multiple. Bottom line is there's a lot of different things that need to change about the sport, and Ryan Day's trying to change them. Ryan Day's doing his best with his voice to try to change some of the issues, and I get it. I get the frustration around him. I get the frustration around Ohio State bringing in all these guys. I get all of that. But the reality is we got to find a way forward without tampering being a part of this game, and if it is, it's let's be fair, it's totally going to be a part of this game going forward, one way or another, whether it's illegal or it's not. It's going to be a part of this game. Now, the best thing you can do is punish these guys as best you can and hope it slowly tapers out of the sport. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. It looks like Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate will stay put at Ohio State, so no real worries in that respect, but this happens all over the sport, and some you hear about, some you don't. If they told you about all of them, then you would see tweets all down your scale. So that is going to be something that we're going to have to watch, and definitely something that I'll bring up tomorrow when I get into kind of if I was commissioner for a day type of a situation. But there's a couple of different things that need to be figured out there. A lot of them can't be figured out until the NCAA gets out of the way and someone new comes into the mix to lead college football the way it probably should be led. So a lot of different things there, and we'll definitely unpack them in more detail. But let's take our second break here. When we come back, let's take an early look at what the NFL draft looks like going into 2025, because there's a lot of really weird groups, if I'm being totally honest. You know, the quarterback group, not quite as strong as it used to be. The defenders are just littered with guys that I think are going to be Hall of Famers. It's going to be really fun to break this down, and we'll do kind of a 50,000 feet view right after this, so stick with us.